Most of you will know that my approach to preaching on a Sunday is to take perhaps a book or a letter of the Bible and to kind of work our way through it. I do that simply because I'm not a creative person. I can't think sort of Sunday by Sunday, oh, that'll be a good talk, or that'll be a good talk, and come up with sort of snappy titles and snappy subjects and that. I'd rather just look and say, right, this is what the verse says, now let's consider what that might say to us. But of course then, we have days like today, don't we? And we have Mothering Sunday, and later on in the year we'll have Father's Day, and you know, there is then a sort of a feeling, for me at least, to say, well, okay, let's just be topical. Let's think about the day. Let's think about what it means. Let's consider perhaps some of the biblical today, for us to consider some of the biblical examples of motherhood and what that might say to us. Now, you know, I count myself as very fortunate. I grew up, even though my own mother has been dead now for some 20 years, I count myself as very fortunate. I grew up very supported, as we all were as brothers, and very supported and very loved and looked after, and I count myself really fortunate, and I count myself very fortunate and blessed to have a very godly and supportive mother-in-law as well. But I realize that that's not everybody's experience. And I realize that sometimes days like today can be difficult, and days like today can be hard and painful, because not everybody's experiences are positive and good. But nevertheless, there is, I think, an opportunity for us to consider some of the examples that we find in Scripture as they talk about motherhood. So there is a sense in which I'm talking to a very specific group of people here this morning, but I don't want everybody else to switch off. You know, particularly, you know, those who haven't experienced motherhood, or the men in the room, I don't want you to switch off, because I think there's something here for all of us, but you'll get a sense of, well, he's really talking to a very specific group of people here. But like I said, I think there's something for us all to consider. I'm not going to be particularly long this morning. I've got a few things I want to share with you, and then we're going to come to a time of communion. And you know, I do want to wish you all a very happy Mother's Day, though. Those of you who will be celebrating, and those of you who will be sort of going out with family and doing different things, I hope you have a really great day. Charles Dickens spoke about motherhood, and he said, I think it must somewhere be written that the virtues of the mothers shall be visited on their children, as well as the sins of their fathers. Ruth received a lovely Mother's Day card this morning. It had a picture of a woman, a youngish woman. No, that wasn't intended to be a comment there. It was just what I'm telling you what the card looks like. It had a picture of a woman holding a baby, a young baby in her arms. And the words coming out of the woman's mouth were, why couldn't you have been a bottle of gin? That's the kind of humor that floats around our own children. But yes, Charles Dickens said, I think it must somewhere be written that the virtues of the mothers shall be visited on their children, as well as the sins of their fathers. I want to just pick out one or two examples from God's Word with regards to mothers. I want to first of all talk about influence and give you an example of an influential mother. And that mother is Eve, the very, very first mother. The first woman ever to give birth to a child. That's what the Bible tells us. The first woman ever to give birth to a child. Adam, we're told, named his wife Eve. Eve, though, in the English language is devoid of meaning. You have to go to the original Hebrew language to consider what it means. And Eve means life. And Adam called his wife, therefore, life, because she was the mother of all the living. But she was the first one to experience what childbirth would have been like, what raising a child would have been like, and the level of influence that she would have had. And I wonder if she knew what to expect. Cain is the first to be born. I wonder if she was afraid of what was coming, because no one had ever done it before. There was nobody to tell her this is what it's like. There was no wisdom to be passed down. This was the first mother. I wonder if she knew how important it was going to be and how influential she was going to be as a mother. She had 3 sons named in the Bible. There's Cain, and there's Abel, and there's Seth. And Cain went and murdered Abel. So you have the first mother giving birth to the first children, and one of those children immediately carries out the worst of things. And as I said, mentioned just now, my experience of family life has always been a very positive experience, but I realize that it's not always that for everybody. And you have it here in the very first story of the very first mother, that her son went and murdered her other son, and then wandered off. And then it's through the line of Seth, we're told, that people began eventually then to call on the name of the Lord. Our mothers, they bring us into this world. They nurture us. They provide for us. They raise us up. They teach us. They discipline us. And I'm sure they're not always certain as to how things are going to turn out. And we all know that by our experience. We all have examples of where it goes wrong. But let's not underestimate the potential for influence as someone charged with the responsibility of raising children. And that's as much for the men as it is for the women, for the grandparents as well here. There's responsibility to bring influence to bear. In all the different books of the Bible, mothers are described as loving. They're described in places as appreciative, as weeping, as remembering. They're described in some cases as idolatrous and troubled and cruel and scheming. But they're also described as joyful and good and prayerful. Motherhood itself is described as painful. In Genesis, it's described as dangerous. In John's Gospel, it's described as joyful. In Genesis, again, it's described as the object of prayer. There's so much that we could consider this morning. So much that we could think about. Let me throw out an example of another mother to you. I wonder if you know who I'm talking about. She was a slave among a very brutal people. She was very protective. She took great risks to protect her son. She put her son in a basket in order to protect him. Do you know who I'm talking about? The mother of, and her name was Jochebed. And we find something of her story in Exodus 2, where it says, now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Now, we are aware of the context. We are aware of the story. Moses' mother took great risk in order to protect her son. Why? Because she's part of a very brutal time in history. She's a slave. And the plan of the Egyptians who have enslaved this group of people, the plan was to control them, to control the Hebrew people through controlling the male population. The Hebrew people would become a stagnant race, they thought. They would lose their influence, they would lose their numbers if we could control them, the Egyptians thought. But the problem for the leader in Egypt, Pharaoh, is that the Israelite midwives didn't listen to him. They didn't listen to the command, and they allowed the boys to live. And so the nation grows and grows and grows, and it becomes strong in both spirit and in number. And that becomes a very fearful thing for their masters, the Egyptians. And the cruelty doesn't end. And so Moses, this child described as fine by his mother, is at risk. And so she makes a decision to protect him. She makes a decision to hide him. And so she takes this papyrus basket and she makes it waterproof and she puts it on the Nile with the baby in it. And his sister keeps an eye out and sees what happens, the rescue that occurs. And she even goes up to the one who has rescued Moses and offered a woman that she just happens to know to be the nurse for the baby. And so Moses' own mother becomes his nanny. And the protection, therefore, continues. The influence continues. The protection continues. And mothers have an opportunity to protect. Physically, they keep us from danger, but they can protect us morally by showing us what's right from wrong. They can protect us emotionally by keeping us from the things that they know will hurt us. As we raise children in this world, we are very aware of the dangers and the risks. And as parents and as mothers, we have opportunity to protect emotionally, not just physically, but emotionally from those things that might cause harm to our children. Mothers can protect our spirits, can potentially bring us up to love and serve the Lord. So we have examples here as we consider just two mothers. First of all, Eve and then Jochebed. We have examples of influence and protection. Let's move on to the example of a supportive mother. Here's a woman who prayed for a son. She was barren and she prayed for a son for many years. And she enters into a kind of a deal with God that if you give me a son, I will give him back to you. And that woman's name is Hannah. And the boy's name is Samuel. And we find his story and her story in the book that's named after him, 1 Samuel, in the Old Testament. And it says there in chapter 1, after he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When the bull had been sacrificed, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, "Pardon me, my Lord, as surely as you live. I am the woman who stood here beside you, praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord for his whole life. He will be given over to the Lord." And he worshipped the Lord there. Here's Hannah, described in the harshest of terms as being barren. And she's prayed and prayed and prayed for many years for this boy. And after the years of prayer and after all the enduring, God gives her a son. And she in turn gives him back to the Lord. It's a deal that she strikes. Give me a son and I'll give him back to you. And Samuel is taken to the Lord's house when he was of an appropriate age. And he was left with the priests to become a servant of the Lord. Now we can look at that story and think, gosh, that's so far away. That's so historical. What on earth is the example here for us? Well, it's an example of support, but it's also an example of dedication. Many of the young families associated with this church have brought their children here to be dedicated. And in the process of that dedication, we are thanking God for the child, but we're also saying this child is yours, God. And through whatever happens with that child, particularly if they end up serving the Lord, then we are there to support them and to encourage them. And here's an example of Hannah who could have reneged on the deal and says, I've got my child now and I'm keeping my child and I'm going to keep my child close at hand. But no, she fulfilled her promise to God. Here he is, God, for you. And I'm going to carry on supporting through this whole process. God answers prayers. Now, we're all realistic Christians here today, and we know that God doesn't answer prayers sometimes in the way that we would like him to, or even at all for us in some moments. But God does answer prayer, and he answered the prayer of Hannah for this boy. And then she goes on to give that child to the Lord. And when we are in the fortunate position of having children or grandchildren, we perhaps as Christians ought to consider that seriously. Lord, here is this child. Now, I'm thanking you for them or her, and I'm giving him back to you. And I'm going to support them in whatever it is they want to do for you. There's another example of a mother here. We move from influence and protection and support through to instruction. You have an example here of a mother who through her instruction causes remarkable things to happen. Her name is Eunice, and she's the mother of a boy called Timothy. And Paul writes to Timothy and says, I thank God whom I serve as my ancestors did, with a clear conscience, as night and day I constantly remember you in my prayers. Recalling your tears, I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy. I am reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now lives in you also. There is a line of instruction from Lois to Eunice to Timothy. There is faith passed down. It's a generational thing. My fear for this land in which we live currently is that the generational passing down of faith is stopping. There's becoming a break in the line. There are children who once had grandparents and great-grandparents who were Christians, but now they know nothing of the things of God because somewhere there's been this break. The instruction has ceased to be passed on. It's stopped. When I grew up as a child, I knew somebody who went to church. They weren't perhaps immediately family members, but somewhere in the line, I knew somebody who went to church. I knew somebody who was a Christian. But there are so many children now, if you ask them, do you have a Christian in your family? They don't. They don't know anybody of influence, Christian influence in their family, because the generational thing has stopped. It's come to an end. But here we have an example of instruction being passed down from Lois to Eunice to Timothy. And that instruction bears tremendous fruit in the life of Timothy. Abraham Lincoln says, no man is poor who has had a godly mother. And the risk is whenever you talk about stuff like this on a Sunday morning, it can all sound a bit quaint and it can all sound a bit twee, but there's some real important points here. Mothers, grandmothers, fathers, grandfathers have opportunity to bring influence, to support, to bring instruction to children. Tony Campolo, an author, a speaker, Christian author and speaker, sociologist by profession, a professor of sociology, wrote in his book, The Power Delusion, about his wife. And he says, too many times women are made to feel that they should apologize for being mothers and housewives. In reality, such roles are a noble calling. When I was on the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania, there were gatherings from time to which faculty members brought their spouses. Inevitably, some woman lawyer or sociologist would confront my wife with the question, and what is it that you do, my dear? And my wife, he says, who is one of the most brilliantly articulate individuals I know, had a great response. I am socializing two Homo sapiens in the dominant values of the Judeo-Christian tradition, in order that they might be instruments for the transformation of the social order into the teleologically prescribed utopia inherent in the eschaton. And when she followed that with, and what is it that you do? The other person's, I'm a lawyer, just didn't sound so overpowering. And essentially what he says his wife was saying, I'm bringing up a couple of kids in the Christian way. And I'm hoping that those Christian kids are going to influence society and bring in something of God's kingdom. There's opportunity that we should not take for granted to bring influence to bear. There's another mother, finally, to talk about. We've thought about support, and we've thought about influence and instruction and protection, all of these things. But what about loyalty? What about loyalty? Well, there's this other mother that we should consider, and her name is Mary. Betrothed to Joseph, spoken to by Gabriel. Mary, who stands at the cross, watching her son die, loyal to the end, loyal to her son. You know, it is hard sometimes to look at our kids and think, you know what, no matter what they do, I'm going to stay loyal, because sometimes the things that they do hurt, and sometimes the things that they do cause pain and suffering and separation and anxiety. And it's hard to say, do you know what, whatever you do, I'm going to stay loyal to you. Doesn't mean to condone, it doesn't mean to approve of. It means to stick with. And I'm grateful to the people that I've met over the years, both men and women, who have not given up. But they hang in there and they're loyal. And they stick with. There's a man by the name of John Killinger, and he wrote a lovely book called Lost in Wonder, Love and Praise. And he says, I believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God, who was born of the promise to a virgin named Mary. I believe in the love Mary gave her son, which caused her to follow him in his ministry and stand by the cross as he died. I believe, he says, in the love of all mothers and its importance in the lives of the children they bear. It is stronger than steel, softer than down, and more resilient than a green sapling on the hillside. It closes wounds, it melts disappointments, it enables the weakest child to stand tall and straight in the fields of adversity. I believe that this love, even at its best, is only a shadow of the love of God, a dark reflection of all that we can expect of him, both in this life and the next. And I believe that one of the most beautiful sights in the world is a mother who lets this greater love flow through her to her child, blessing the world with the tenderness of her touch and the tears of her joy. Protection, support, instruction, loyalty. I hope we don't look at these this morning and think this is just too high an ideal. It's just too unattainable. I can't do that. A wiser person than me once said, there is just one way to bring up a child in the way that he should go, and that is to travel that way yourself. And so to the mums who protect us and support us and instruct us and who are loyal to us, we all should say a huge thank you. And to the young mothers that are here today, we should say, protect your kids, support them, teach them, remain loyal to them. And to all the men who switched off right at the start, here's what I have to say to you. Protect your kids, support them, teach them, remain loyal to them. You know, Mother's Day sends children scurrying to the greeting cards aisle to find just the right sentiment for mum. Or not, as is the case of my children. But this celebration touches lives, undeniably so. Our radios were full of messages this morning for mum. And all of us have or have had a mother. And for the people of God who delight in the commands of God, this day holds something of significance, a meaning that goes far beyond just a calendar date. Because in the Old Testament, we are instructed to bring honor to our parents. It's an ancient command. It's a beautiful command. And it's there for the glory of God and for our good. It's the fifth of the 10 commandments. It speaks of showing honor to parents so that it might go well with you. All of us are sons and daughters. I pray that today we think beyond the card aisle to look at how we might show honor, particularly to our mothers today. We're going to take a moment.